Today's podcast is brought to you by Funny Bone Broth, now available at Italy and McEwen's in the TD Center. Or you can visit them at funnybonebroth.com.
In a world where it seems totally normal to listen to a podcast about the Toronto Argonauts, it's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the X's and Argos podcast. I'm your host, Ben Grant. Today we're going to be talking about the additions that the Toronto Argonauts have made on the defensive side of the ball. If you didn't catch last week's episode, we talked about the offense. Today we're going to focus on defense and special teams as we look at the new Toronto Argo pieces. And there's quite a number of them. They've been very busy in adding players. We talked a little bit about that last week. This is an unusually high number of guys that we've got coming in on both sides of the ball. So first of all, we'll look at players that have been released, and there's only one on the defensive side of the ball. That's Anthony Covington. He missed half the season last year, had some rough moments. The poor guy came back from injury into that BC game where we got shellacked, and he was assigned to cover Brian Burnham for most of that game. And he had Burnham covered like the whole game, and somehow Burnham ended up catching, like 5,000 yards and 8 touchdowns in that game. It was just one of those things where it just wasn't meant to be, and maybe a change of scenery will do Covington some good as he tries out some other options. Guys we've brought back, so re-signed Tyler Capina, the kicker. Tyler, you remember he replaced Drew Brown after Brown sort of blew it in the early season BC game. Capina's from McMaster. He's a guy I really like. I worry a little bit about him because he didn't seem to have that range last year. You remember he was short a couple times on 50-yard attempts. And that's not something that we really saw him do at McMaster. He had a rocket leg. So I don't know if that was an injury he was dealing with or something like that. I know he did miss a game down the stretch, so maybe there's something to that. And hopefully he's got that distance back again because his accuracy was pretty good. He just you really would like to have a kicker that you can count on from 50. And you could see down the stretch, they just, they sent him out a couple of times. And then after that, it was pretty much 45 and under. Bear Woods is coming back, linebacker. Bear Woods, he's going to be 33 to start the season. I like him a lot as a leader, as a locker room guy. I'm not sure how much he still has at linebacker. He played all right last year, but remember, he looked so good in Montreal not long ago, but he had a lot of talent around him there. And it's really hard to gauge his performance last year. But even if he had nothing, and he's obviously got way more than that, but even if he had nothing, his leadership and his presence in the locker room, I think, make him, it's just a no-brainer. You have to bring back Bear Woods. So I'm excited he's coming back. I'm sure the rest of his Argos teammates are happy to have him back too. Justin Thomas is coming back, defensive tackle. Hey, he had some really great moments too. I'd like to see him with a full camp under his belt. Remember, he came in mid-July, didn't really get on the field until near the end of August, and made an impact. But let's see what he looks like now with a full camp, full season. I expect some pretty big things from Thomas. And they're bringing back the long snapper, Joe Spaziani, 24 years old. He's such a smart football player, great athlete. He was actually a quarterback and a safety in high school. His dad's a football coach, and that is the case with a lot of long snappers. It's amazing how many long snappers have a dad who's a football coach. And I think there's something to that because every coach knows how valuable a long snapper is. And so telling your son early on, start learning to long snap, because if there's a way to get your foot in the door, and I don't know, he ended up going to Virginia as a quarterback, but also a long snapper, and I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't that long snapping ability that was really the reason he was there, because he's a very good long snapper, but they're so valuable. Like myself coaching, I've ended up using a 185-pound long snapper, which isn't ideal. He was a receiver, but again, he had a dad that had played football and was aware, and he said to him, one of the first things, if you're going to start playing football, learn how to long snap, and there he was as our long snapper at 185 pounds. It's such a valuable thing. So it's good to have Spaziani back again. Anytime you can add smart football players to the field, which he is, it's a good idea. So let's talk about the DBs that we're bringing in. We'll start with Travis Lee, 6 feet, 178. He's 29 years old. So he played with Hamilton in 2016. Argos took a look at him. He spent some time in the Arena League. Fast, explosive. He takes chances, like probably to a fault, but they're not based on nothing. Like he plays tendencies, and so he tries to get into a quarterback's head. His favorite receiver, favorite routes. I love that about him. But the problem is when you gamble as a DB, you give up your share of big plays too. He's not a super physical player, not a great tackler, but he knows the league. There's some film on him now, so the Argos obviously know what they're getting, and this could be his last shot maybe at 29. So we'll see what Travis Lee can bring us. But if he arrives in camp and really gives her, I think we're going to get something pretty good from him. Troy Hansen is the next guy that I want to talk about. 6'4", 212. He's 24 years old, played at Alberta. He's probably going to need some time, but he's worth a shot. So he's not that fast. Actually, his straight line speed is good, but his change of direction is poor. And it makes sense at 6'4". That's pretty typical. He hits like a truck, which I love, and he'll get a chance to shine on specials. He could be a really nice contributor there, but obviously the plan going forward probably includes him playing elsewhere as well. But it's someone that's just going to need a little bit of time. And you notice that as we go through the DBs here especially, and as you notice that there's only really one linebacker that the Argos are bringing in, and that's because a lot of these DBs are going to end up kind of playing a sort of a hybrid role. We saw that like last year. They even had Ford playing the Sam backer in a couple of games, one of the smaller DBs we had on the field. But that's what happens when they go into that sort of dime personnel and we end up in a base 4-3, you end up with your DBs playing traditional linebacker spots, and that's very CFL. That wasn't unique to the Argos. But I think when you look at the guys they're bringing in, we're talking about guys that are over 6 feet, that are over 200 pounds for the most part, these DBs, that can be linebackers, safeties, and inside cover guys. They're not bringing in a ton of exclusive corners. So Troy Hansen, this 6'4", 212 guy from Alberta, he fits that mold, and they'll see what they have in him. Dondre Wright's the next guy, 5'10", 210, looks like a linebacker. We were just talking about that. Like, you see this guy, you see him walking around, you see him walking into the stadium, you're like, well, that's a linebacker, because he just sort of has that build. He's 25 years old, he's from Ajax, had a nice season with Montreal a couple years ago. He's been pretty quiet since. He couldn't really get on the field in Winnipeg. But if you can get a Canadian DB on the field, that's a huge advantage. And I really like the fact that he does have that linebacker build with the skill set of a DB, because he plays like a DB. He looked good in Montreal, and if he can return to form, then this is a huge signing. The next DB we'll talk about is Abu Conte, 6'1", 202, 24 years old. He's a Canadian national, played at Grambling, lightly used by Winnipeg in 2017, 2018, and he ended up being an early cut in the 2019 preseason. Calgary took a shot at him, dressed for 5 games. I don't know what it is that hasn't panned out for Conte. I'm not sure, and I haven't seen him play at all. I was reading a little bit about him. I couldn't find any real film on him. There just wasn't enough playing time. See a play here or play there. Nothing to really gauge on. So it's another guy that if you can somehow find a role for him as a Canadian, there's huge value there. But I don't know enough to be able to say, well, this is why he hasn't been on the field, or here's why we should be hopeful. My fingers are crossed, but that's about all I can give you on Abu Conte. Malik Reeves is interesting. So Malik Reeves, DB, 6 feet, 200 pounds, 24 years old, out of Villanova. He only really ever played corner, but I think he's got to be a safety or Sam backer. Super physical. Now, he doesn't have top-end speed or quickness. Maybe you could get away with him as a boundary corner, but I think that's why he didn't really get a shot in the NFL, because he probably would have been a step behind. But I think as a boundary corner, you might be able to get away with something. I love his physicality, and he certainly is great at jamming people on the line. But I think they're probably bringing him in thinking that he'll be competing for a safety spot or a linebacker spot, Sam linebacker specifically. But I think he's going to get burned if he's left alone on the outside. He belongs on the field, though. Great athlete. So we just have to change his position, and I think they'll find a spot for him. Erman Lane is the next player I want to talk about. Tall DB, 6'3", 210, 25 years old. He is the quintessential tweener. Florida State didn't even know what to do with this guy. So he came to Florida State as a 5-star receiver. He ended up moving to corner after some time, then played a little free safety, and then back to receiver again. Amazing athlete, but they just didn't know where exactly to put him. And obviously that hurt his draft stock because they didn't know what kind of player they were drafting. People were just looking at him as an athlete. So if the Argos can find a spot for him, he plays when you watch him, especially like he was a 5-star receiver. We're not going to forget that part, but he's committed now to being a defensive player, but a defensive player that reads the ball in the air like a receiver. He breaks very quickly, sees the ball well out of the quarterback's hands, anticipates routes very well. I don't know what he's going to be able to do in the CFL, but I would see him. I think I'd have to see him as a free safety, but I wouldn't mind if the Argos gave him a go at a linebacker spot too. But I think he's one of those two things. I don't think he's going to end up playing on the corner, but I would love to see him, especially in that Canadian setup, just playing center field with his combination of size, speed, and the ability to track the ball. I could see him just figuring out exactly where the quarterback's going to go with the ball and getting there to make a play. I think from the free safety spot, we're looking at a ton of picks for this kid. Devontae Merriweather, DB, 6'1", 200 pounds, 26 years old. He's a track guy, pretty heavily recruited. He's kind of got an interesting story. So heavily recruited initially out of high school. And then for a variety of reasons, he ended up having to go to the JUCO route. Then he was all set to play at San Diego State. The plans fell through. Ends up heading to West Texas A&M. And he's been playing with the IFL's Arizona Rattlers for the last couple of years. Playing really well, too. Defensive Player of the Year. He can do everything. When you watch his film, and I know I find it hard to gauge IFL just because it's so different, but great tackler. He's fast, plays the ball like a receiver, reads the QB really well, and he can play anywhere in the defensive backfield. You can put him at corner, you can put him at free, you can have him on the inside. Probably not a linebacker. I just don't think that it plays into his strengths. Even though he's a great tackler, it's not the way he tackles. He's great at tackling receivers, and it's just a whole different game when you talk about tackling a running back coming right at you from a few yards away. But I would be comfortable seeing him play anywhere in the defensive backfield. I'm pretty excited about him. I think he's a big find. Chris Humes, 6 feet, 201, 25 years old. Arkansas State, Raiders took a look. He's been with the Bombers the last 2 seasons, ended up getting released in September, and he just didn't get a lot of opportunities in Winnipeg. Reminds me a little bit of Abu Conte in that I know that people have seen things in him. There's just not enough film out there for me to really get a good sense of what he can do. There's a little bit more than there was with Conte, but I would just be jumping to conclusions based on watching 2 or 3 plays, so I don't really know. But we'll learn pretty quickly, I think, and be able to figure out, what it was that got people's attention right away, like why the Raiders thought, hey, let's take a look at this guy. And maybe we'll also see why the Blue Bombers decided, no, I don't think he's for us. So Chris Humes, a lot of question marks, but hopefully he has something to bring to the table in camp. All right, the last defensive back we're going to talk about is a guy they just signed today, Tyler Ziegler, out of Wheaton. That's a D3 school. Another big DB, 6'2", 215, 23 years old, which I like. I've been watching film on him over the last couple hours. It is tough to evaluate D3 guys when you spent the last couple weeks looking primarily at D1 and pro-level athletes. Ziegler looks amazing, but the level of competition is poor by comparison. So I ended up watching really more Arizona Cardinals tape than Wheaton tape. Ziegler played the whole preseason with the Cardinals. It was cut on the final cut-down day, and that's saying something because the Cardinals had a pretty stacked defensive secondary. He's not fast by pro standards or particularly agile, but he's really long, and that makes up for being a step behind if the throw isn't perfect. Very smart. So he disguises coverages really well. He knows exactly what he's looking at, anticipates the play beautifully, and is just generally sort of a nuisance. He can also jump out of the stadium, which is cool. Now, aside from his reach, he doesn't use his size that well. He's a big guy, but he'll make the occasional big hit, but not when the receiver or running back is bracing for it and looking to deliver a hit themselves. His big hits tend to be when stuff that where the receiver can't quite get his balance or something like that. And he does have a few of those, but doesn't use his size as well as you might hope for a guy that's 6'2", 215. So we'll have to see. Like, obviously there's something there to take a guy, for the Cardinals to take a guy from D3 and say, let's give you a shot, and for him to make it all the way through. Clearly he's got some real athletic qualities, but running a 4.6, having trouble with change of direction, those things may be too much to overcome. But I love how smart he is. I really like how he hides coverage and anticipates those plays. So there's something to look forward to in him as well. So that's a kind of exciting signing just today. So that does it for the DBs. And like I said off the top, you notice with all those DBs, a lot of those guys could end up seeing some time in a cover backer spot, but really not a lot of outside corners. So we're looking for coverage on slot receivers. We're looking for free safeties. I think that's kind of interesting because it says something about the level of comfort that they have with the corners that are currently on the team or that they plan on bringing back. And we've got a couple big free agents that we're hoping that they bring back, and we'll leave that for a later podcast as we start focusing our attention to Argos that are currently on the roster and Argos that absolutely need to come back, and who we're maybe looking at as someone to come in and compete and try and win their job back. So there's one linebacker that they brought in, one true linebacker, I should say, that they brought in. That's Jason Beck, Eastern Michigan. I like Jason Beck a lot. 6'1", 220. If you watched any MAC football last year, you probably fell in love with this guy too. Captain of the defense, great leader, always around the ball, and he just doesn't miss tackles. He's quick. He's great in coverage by linebacker standards. He can take on bigger receivers one-on-one. And his durability is off the charts. So he played in 49 games over 4 years, tied a school record, started 47 of those games. But just back to the beginning again, it's a little bit, he's got a lot of the same qualities as Bear Woods, but it's a much younger version of him that just doesn't have the same amount of mileage. But wonderful leadership. And I love the idea of Jason Beck learning under a guy like Bear and taking things from his locker room presence and how he's able to contribute to the team, and also just all the stuff that Woods knows. Jason Beck's a student of the game. He'll pick that stuff up. He'll be an outstanding player in the CFL, if not this year, in a couple years' time, because he's ready to absorb everything he can. Defensive line is where we'll end things. A couple guys brought in, including one of the most high-profile guys, and we'll get to him last, but let's look first at Prince Unebu, defensive end, 6'5", 250. So he's from Pace University, which I actually had to look up. I hadn't heard of Pace University before. He's got some pretty interesting film, like a lot of these guys. So his backstory might even be more interesting than his film, though. So he was playing slot back and tight end for his entire college career. So he had 4 years of playing slot back and tight end, and then as a grad student, in his last year of eligibility, he switches to defense and he's all conference. So it seems like they're just a little bit late on the uptake there at Pace, because he's a great defensive end. And I don't know if they were stacked for the other 4 years at defensive end and they just never thought that it would work out. Sometimes that just happens where you just never even consider it. A guy's played slot back or receiver or whatever it was his whole career, and maybe you never think about a position change. But he really wasn't much of a contributor as a slot back or as a tight end. And suddenly you put him on the defensive line, and in 1 year, he's all conference. So he didn't actually play football last season because he'd used up all his eligibility and he was finishing up his degree, which are things that I really like, actually. This guy's played a lot of football, but he also takes his academics seriously and wanted to finish school. I think that's a really positive attribute to having a football player. And you should see this guy defend read option. You better, as a quarterback, you better hope you're not within 5 yards of him and he sees that you've got the ball. His first 2 steps are so fast for a man that size. There are a number of plays you can see him in where the quarterback's trying to read him. He does a great job of playing it honestly. He's sort of sliding his feet. And as soon as he sees that the quarterback keeps it, there's like a tenth of a second, and suddenly the quarterback is being pile-drived into the ground. He's so fast with that. I'm excited to watch him play in the CFL. I think this is going to be a really nice style of football for him, and I'm really excited to see him on the end of the line. The one drawback, of course, is that he just hasn't played a lot of football on the defensive side. But he's smart, he's motivated, and he's got that athleticism. That burst is crazy. You should look that up. It's pretty fun to watch. Ryan Davis, the next guy we're going to talk about, defensive line. So if Davis can stay healthy, this could be the defensive signing of the year for the Argos. And I know that's a big if and a big could. Davis played for Jacksonville 2012 to 2015, signed with the Cowboys 2016. But he had a hamstring injury, injured his knee. He ended up getting put on injured reserve. So Buffalo picks him up the next year, 2017. It went all right. 2018, the Rams sign him, and he ends up spending the whole season on injured reserve. And then in 2019, he had a neck injury and was on injured reserve there too. So here we are now, 2020. He's an Argo. Great athlete. He's really good on the defensive line. 6'2", 275. He's 30 years old now, and obviously that's not usually when you start getting better, when you've been banged up and you're 30 years old. But if he has something left in the tank and he can stay healthy, Ryan Davis will be awesome. But there are a lot of ifs in there. And so clearly this is not the only guy you want to hang your hat on. And so they also brought in Earl O'Kine. So Earl O'Kine, defensive line, 6'7", 290, another 30-year-old player. So he's bounced around, and I'm nervous about him for different reasons than the reasons that I'm nervous about Davis. He has played on so many different football teams, and that's a little bit of a red flag for me. But talent-wise, there's no question. So then why has he bounced around so much? So since 2013, he's played for the Texans, the Stampeders, the Orlando Predators of the AFL, the Brooklyn Bolts, who I had to look up as well from the Fall Experimental Football League, the Colts, the Chiefs, the Lions, the Cardinals, then the Orlando Apollos from the Alliance, and then the Rough Riders. He has so much friggin' talent, but he's had trouble staying in shape. This might be his last shot, and that's sometimes enough to do it. And if this guy can turn the corner and be completely motivated and dedicated to being a Toronto Argonaut in what might be his last shot, and he comes to camp in shape, and look out, because he's going to be awesome. And just imagine the season if Ryan Davis can stay healthy, Earl O'Kine is motivated, in shape, and driven. Then I don't want to be a quarterback on the other side of the ball. So there's a lot of ifs in there. I know, I get that, but there's also a lot of reasons to be excited. And the last guy we're going to talk about, Ronald Ollie, defensive lineman, 6'1", 292, 24 years old, undrafted out of Nicholls State. Ollie made a name for himself as one of the stars of Last Chance U in that first season. I don't want to talk about him as a TV personality for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's sort of a disservice to him because he's a really good football player. He's here because he's a good football player, not because he was on Last Chance U. And Last Chance U has helped a lot of players get noticed, but it also hangs over you in a way that I think can be a real negative. And so I don't really want to focus on that. Let's talk about him as a football player. So as a football player, we ignore everything else. I really like him. He's a ridiculous athlete. So remember, he's 6'1", he's almost 300 pounds. He runs a 4.9, but the number that really jumps off the charts is 35-inch vertical leap. So that means basically you've got a 6'1" guy that can standing dunk the basketball at 300 pounds. And you think about the level of athleticism there. He's super fast into gaps off the snap, great at chasing down QBs, great motor. I know there have been some character questions, but again, I don't really trust TV shows and I don't want to judge them based on that. So the only negative I can see is that you sometimes see him struggle getting off blocks once he's engaged, especially against longer tackles. Once they get their hands on him, he has trouble getting himself free. I'd really like to see the Argos use Ollie inside as a one tech. I think he'd be a handful. I think he's really tough to block. I wonder if that extra yard in the CFL game might be a little bit of a disadvantage to him, because what was so good about him when you watch his film from Nicholls State is his ability to get into the backfield before the center and guard have come out of their stance, because he's so quick off the snap. And that extra yard that he's going to be fighting in the CFL gives your centers and guards an extra split second to pick him up. And so it's possible that that's going to hurt him. I don't know. We've seen that happen to guys in the past where they've been great at penetrating into the backfield in American football. Suddenly they come to the CFL and they're invisible. And I don't know if he's going to be someone like that. I'm really excited about him. I hope that people will get past the idea of the TV show, because as much as that's why a lot of people know him, it's really not a good place to start. Let's think of him as a football player, just like we do with anyone else. And so that's it. So those are the additions. A ton of guys. There's a lot of reason to be excited about. Looking back through these guys, I'm really interested in what comes of that defensive line. Because remember, we got some good players under contract too, and Justin Thomas that we just talked about. There's a lot to like, and if Lang's back here again, there is a lot going on in that defensive line. This could be an amazing defensive line if things go well. And let's see what comes of that linebacker spot. Is this it? Is this all we're bringing in for linebacker? If so, then a lot of those DBs that we just talked about are probably going to be auditioning for linebacker spots, whether they know it or not. And what's this going to mean for outside corner? Because again, I don't think we've got a lot of candidates from the guys that we're bringing in to play on the outside. Maybe a couple of these guys that I didn't know a lot about end up playing corner and can play corner. I don't know. But what does that say? Who's going to be re-signed? Who's coming in? And the story just gets more and more interesting as we go forward. And I can't wait for the official free agency period to begin, because there are a billion things to be excited about if you're a Toronto Argos fan. And that's long overdue. I don't remember the last time I was this interested in the offseason as a Toronto Argonauts fan. So I think this is a pretty good time to cheer for the double blue. So we'll see what February brings. On our next podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about the CFL winter meetings that are going on right now up in Collingwood. There's a lot of CBA stuff that we'll wade through. Wade through doesn't sound like that. I'm making this sound like it's going to be the worst podcast ever. No, we're going to look at some of the clarifications that I guess that are being made with regards to the CBA, because I know there's a lot of confusion this year since the deal was signed sort of at the last minute. And so the owners want to feel that too. So we'll be able to sort some of that stuff out, and there's going to be some new ratios, I guess clarification on the ratios with regards to Canadian starters, some big changes there, as well as looking at a couple of rule tweaks and interpretations. Of course, also the XFL commissioner recently came out and said they looked really carefully at the CFL and the CFL rules to try and decide what rules would best fit their game. And we can talk a little bit about that as well. If you haven't had a chance to see the article written on xsandargos.com by Jay Burke a few weeks back, he looked at some of the rules that the CFL has that the NFL should adopt. And quite frankly, there's a ton more than that, but he looked at 3 in particular. And very interestingly, the XFL agrees with him on that and think that some of these CFL rules definitely belong in the game of football. And of course, we all know they do, but it's not often that you hear Americans in full agreement on that issue. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Until then, thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, tell all your friends about us. Until next time, I'm Ben Grant. See ya.
Go, Toronto Argos, go, go, go. Pull together, fight the foe.